That is the verdict of the Climate Commission after reviewing the summer just gone, just last week, and how it fits with the long-term weather trends. In the 102 years of national weather records, there have been 21 days when the entire continent averaged more than 39 degrees, 8 of them this summer. According to the Commission, that extreme heat, floods and the bushfires that are becoming increasingly a fact of all our lives are aggravated by shifting heating climate, one that's increasingly prone to extremes. The report is called The Angry Summer, and its lead author, climate scientist Professor Will Steffen, joins you now. Will, good evening.
Good evening. Thanks very much for inviting me.
How extreme was this last summer?
Well, it certainly was a record breaker. I mean, you quoted the 21 days since 1910, over 39 degrees is a continental average, and 8 of them this year. But you look at all sorts of records. I mean, we had the hottest summer on record. We had the hottest January on record. We had the hottest day on record. And the thing that I think was unusual about this is that it covered so much of the continent. When you look at heat waves in the past, 2009 Victoria, 2004 in southeast Queensland and so on, they tended to be regional. This was truly continental. It covered most of Australia, and it also lasted for a long time. You know, those 8 days over 39 degrees that you quoted, 7 of those came in a row, an entire week. Where the average maximum temperature for the entire continent didn't drop below 39 degrees. That's quite remarkable.
How confidently can we relate this back to climate change?
Well, we've got a couple of strong lines of evidence. Now, the way we frame this is, of course, these events are naturally occurring. They're not caused by climate change, but they're influenced by climate change. They're made worse. And the analogy we use is an elite athlete taking steroids. An elite athlete is already an elite athlete without steroids. They're already in the top fraction of 1% of people in the population. But when they take steroids, their performance is enhanced. They run faster, jump higher. Same thing's happening with the climate. There's more heat in the atmosphere. There's more heat in the surface ocean. There's more moisture in the atmosphere. So the physics is pretty clear here. When you've got more heat, background heat in the atmosphere, you're more prone to see high temperature records and less prone to see extreme cold temperature records broken. And indeed, over the last 50 years here in Australia, when we look at all the data, that's exactly the trend we see. If you look at 2000, 2009, there's been more than double the number of high temperature records, hot records, broken than there were 50 years ago. So these are some of the lines of evidence that are telling us that there is an influence here of the underlying shift in the climate.
The climate scientists have always been pretty reluctant. I mean, there's always been this distinction, has there not, between climate and weather, and often it's the people who argue against the apparent reality of climate change who say, well, look at the weather, it's cold today, where's your climate change? You seem to have been put the boot on the other foot here. You're saying it's hot, there you go.
Look, that's a really good question, and I think the difference here is we're framing the question differently. I think in the past a lot of climate scientists were asked, is this extreme weather event, a particular event, caused by climate change? And we've never said that it has been caused. We use a very different concept and a different word, and that's influenced. These events would occur anyway, but just like an elite athlete would be very, very good anyway, their performance gets even better if they're on steroids. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the influence of the background shift in climate pushing these temperature records even higher than they otherwise would be. This would have been a hot summer anyway, but not an extremely hot summer.
I mean, some of those same folk would make the argument very much recently that the warming has been suspended, that there's a 17-year pause in that warming of the Earth.
Well, that's certainly incorrect if you understand the climate system. And let me explain why that's so. People say the warming has stopped, or the world or the Earth has stopped warming. 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases goes into the ocean. 3% goes into the air. Climate scientists actually don't look at the air that much. They look at the ocean. And when you look at the ocean temperature record, heat content record, it's still going up. There's been no pause, no drop in the rate. It continues to go up through 2010, the last year we have measurements for it. So, and that's where 90% of the heat is going. So there is absolutely no doubt that the Earth has not stopped warming, despite what some people say.
And if that is the case, the sort of severity we're seeing now this is a rather mixed metaphor, but just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, it is in a way, in that because of the big inertia in the ocean and all that heat that's stored there, we're pretty certain over the next decade or two you're going to see more high temperature records broken, more hot weather, and there's a likelihood too that more extreme rainfall will come our way. The real chance we have to turn this around comes after a couple of decades, and by getting emissions down now we can influence how that climate shift goes after about 2040 or so. There's enough inertia in the system. We can't influence a whole lot before 2040, but we can certainly influence it a lot after 2040.
So a certain amount of change will take place, whatever happens now?
Yeah, that's simply because of the inertia in the system.
So what sort of, can you put a degree sum on that?
Oh, if you look at the average temperature by 2040 or 2050, you'll probably see another half degree to a degree, somewhere in that range. Now, bear in mind that these extreme records we saw this summer, the background rise in temperature over Australia is a little under 1 degree. So when I'm saying we're looking at another half to 1 degree, that's another quite large amount of additional heat in the air that's going to be pushing these temperatures up.
Well, Stephen, thank you.
My pleasure.
Professor Stephen, lead author of a new report out today from the Climate Commission, The Angry Summer. 25 and a bit after 6. Some of your thoughts on these developments in Western Sydney. Motorway.
Well, YouTube, there you go. The Angry Summer. As I've been saying, because I read about it years and years ago, if you add more heat to the atmospheric heat engine, that allows it to contain more water, and water has 10 times the thermal mass of steel. We've increased the average humidity by 5%. We've increased the global average temperature by 0.8 of a degree. That's pretty serious stuff. I get a lot of my information out of New Scientist magazine. This is 19th of January. And it shows how shifting the average temperature by 1 degree hotter changes the incidence of extreme events. Now, the left-hand bell curve, the lightly drawn bell curve, the one with the little grey wedges, those little grey wedges are your extreme events, and they're happening, well, you'd have to say less than 10% of the time. Once you shift the temperature 1 degree to the hot side, you flatten the bell curve, you squeeze it out more, and the hot weather events are now happening, well, pretty much 70% of the time. So what used to be extreme becomes the new normal, and that dark red wedge out there, what's happening 30% of the time, that's the unprecedented. That's the stuff that's never happened before. Now this is purely written with respect to the bushfires which were happening in January. Why were we having such unprecedented heat waves? Well, because we increased the temperature by 0.8 of a degree, and therefore we got unprecedented, and unprecedented is now pretty much the new extreme, and what used to be extreme is the new normal. So that's the fiery side of the equation. 2 weeks later, 2nd of February's New Scientist magazine, and they were talking about unprecedented floods on the Australian east coast, through central and south Queensland, all the way down the New South Wales coast. Big time floods. At Grafton, 100 miles east of here, they had within 1 centimetre of the top of the levee. If it was a 9 metre levee, they went to 8.99. If it was a 9.13 metre levy, they went to 9.12. You know, they were within a bee's dick of being flooded at Grafton. And everybody said, oh, how unprecedented. And then last week it happened again. There was 3 weeks gap between the two most unprecedented floods. Because if this is what happens on the hot end of the scale when you push the temperature 0.8 of a degree to the right, you get a very similar effect on the storm extremity level of the scale when you put 5% more water into the air that is 0.8 of a degree hotter. So, my soil moisture profile gauge is full. We only had 2 millimetres here today, but the spring under my hut is flowing, and the ground is as wet as it can be without being seriously inconvenient and dropping a tree on my place. But apart from the effects on me, a place called Gympie in Queensland's been flooded 5 times in a year, and I think they've been burnt twice as well. All of the places, literally, where the global warming denialists cluster the closest, the broadacre agricultural areas, the coal fields, the coal basins, they've been rained on so heavily that what they call legacy water in old mines, Mount Tom Morgan gold mine for example, the mines have filled up with water. They haven't been worked for years because it wasn't economic to keep working them. Nobody's been pumping the pits out. What's coming out of those mines is now about the same acidity as battery acid, because there was sulphides in the rocks and it was safe when it was underground, and nobody ever bothered to backfill the pit. So there's existing mines that can't be worked, there's transport links that won't get to the coast to export the products of the existing mines, and the existing mines and the old mines are pumping battery acid into the water system for the downstream irrigators to have fun with, but they're not worried because at the moment they're flooded. The tourist traps up and down the coast have been destroyed for what, twice in 3 weeks? You could really generally say that Gaia's revenge is targeting the people who are most recalcitrant when it comes to recognising global warming. Up here in the New England tablelands, we've got more trees than any other agricultural district in Australia. So said my bushfire captain 10 years ago when the drought was biting at its hardest, and he went and had a look on Google Earth. And we chewed it over and we concluded that the reason we had better rainfall was because we had more trees, and the reason we had more trees was because back in the 1970s, DDT in the food chain caused the birds' eggshells to get so thin that there was a population crash in the birds that eat leaf-eating insects. The insects overbred, chewed the leaves off the trees, and all the trees around here died. New England dieback, they call it. The only thing that saved the day was a drought, killed the beetles. And then after the drought, the beetles and the birds came back in harmony. And so the farmers here in the New England tablelands, by being scared in the 70s when they thought they were going to have to live in a treeless expanse of desolation, they started to conserve the environment before the rest of the farmers in Australia even began to think the environment was worth paying attention to. Perhaps wishful thinking, delusions of grandeur, ideas of reference, religious megalomania, perhaps, therefore, thus and because, the reason that up here we're not getting hammered quite as hard as other people in other places is because we haven't been, collectively as a bunch of people on the landscape, we haven't been hammering the earth quite as hard as everybody else has. We got a fright back in the 70s. Maybe on the other hand, we're just in the right place at the right time and the horrible changes haven't hit us yet. But whether you're an atheist or whether you got some throbbing traditional religion or whether you're just a climate scientist, the idea of Gaia's revenge is pretty bloody funny when you think about it. The idea that extreme weather events could be targeted so that micrometeorology could hammer the bastards who are causing the problem and put them out of business before it gets any worse. Because you know what? Our politicians aren't doing jack diddly shit, and they're not planning on doing jack diddly shit. The left-wing side of politics, the Labor side of politics, they represent people who want a job they can work in safely for life. The right side of politics, the National Party, the Conservatives, the Liberal Party as they call themselves in Australia, well, they just want to safeguard their right to exploit the landscape, the environment and the workforce, to guard their right to property and guard their right to make a profit. By any reading, those two sides of politics are utterly uninterested in scaling back the economy for the sake of the environment. So therefore the environment is going to scale back their economy for the sake of the biosphere. Welcome to global warming. Trying to squelch the evidence has not taken the problem away. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Hope you enjoyed it. Ciao.